Okay, at this point, you are going to start looking at more of your details. So, looking at the shape of that tail, kind of drawing it out as I see it in a simple shape, and then replicating that by pinching and squeezing and manipulating the clay to be the size and shape that I want it to be. So, I'm measuring that the tail should be a little bit less than half of the body. So, I can start off with what I think is the right size and then cut it down or add to it until I feel it matches the form. So I'm always like triple checking my measurements, making sure things look in proportion, and then I'm going to score and slip this shape onto the back of my bird. I'm still working with a solid piece of clay. This is not hollowed out yet. Doesn't matter how thick I make it or how much clay I add. I'll be hollowing it out in this video, so you're going to get to see that next step. So I'm just going to smooth that in, check the positioning, and then I'll start to build up around the tail so it flows a little bit more smoothly into the body, as opposed to having such a sharp kind of edge that attaches. So these little pieces of clay that I'm smoothing and blending in, I don't score and slip those. I usually just score and slip the large shapes to one another. You can see on the opposite side I still have some work to do. See how it's uneven? I want to come in and fill in that side where the tail is not centered and get that even. So this is why it's important to look at your object that you're sculpting, not just from both sides, but from the top, from the bottom, and see it from every angle to get it right where you want it. So now that I'm happy with the shape, I'm going to cut my piece in half. You're going to do the same thing. You're going to take your wire cutters and you're going to slide through the middle of your piece, cutting it into two halves. This is where we're going to draw a border line. So I'm looking for that 1/4 of an inch, giving myself a 1/4 of an inch border around the whole piece. And then I'm going to do it to the other side. And then I'm going to start to scoop the insides out using my ribbon tool. You can use the rounded edge or the flat edge, whatever you prefer. But I'm just going to very slowly come in and start to scoop out the insides, almost like when you're scooping out the insides of a pumpkin before you carve it into a jack-o'-lantern. I'm holding the piece very carefully in my hand as a support. And your goal is to take clay out until the entire piece is a 1/4 of an inch all the way around. So I want to keep carving deeper and deeper until I get to that 1/4 of an inch mark throughout the whole form. This means I'll stop periodically and I will kind of feel and check my distance between my fingers, like my thumb and my index finger. And it tells me if I need to go deeper, or it tells me if I've gone a little bit too far. If you do go a little bit too thin, you can pinch clay into it and kind of fill it back out. You don't want to have any area where your walls are paper thin, so you've got to go slow and steady and very carefully take it down to that 1/4 of an inch mark. If you rush this, there's a really high chance that you are going to go too far and punch through the form or leave a piece that is too thick. So I can kind of feel around where it feels thicker than 1/4 of an inch, go back in and take out more clay. And you'll have some areas on your form where you have to carve deeper and some where it'll be more shallow. Where my bird's head meets the body, it's pretty thin there. So although I have to carve out the head quite a bit, I'm going to be very careful around that neck or attachment between the head and the body, because that is a thinner area and I don't want to pop through there. So not all of your shape might have the same amount carved out, if that makes sense. And then once I have it where I want it, I just go in and kind of do like a quick smooth just to get rid of any rough spots. Doesn't have to be perfect, but it makes the piece function better. So I've done both sides, okay? On one of these sides, you are going to poke a hole in the bottom. So whatever part touches the table, you're going to take the back of your pin tool and poke a hole, just one hole. And it doesn't matter which side you pick. You're then going to roll a coil. This coil is going to become a tube, so it cannot be too thin. I'm going to roll that out. It's probably as thick as my index finger. And I'm cutting it down pretty short because it has to fit inside my form. So right now I'm measuring. And what I want is a little gap between the top of the coil and the top of my piece. So you can see that little gap right there. That's what I want. You do not want the coil to be the same height as your piece. You need to have that little gap. Once I know this is the right height, I'm going to take my pin tool and poke through the coil very carefully so that it becomes a tube and I can see through it. I am then going to score and slip that tube directly over the hole I've created. I should be able to tilt the piece and see all the way through it. So that hole should line up directly with the hole in the tube. So I'm going to score and slip. I'm going to tilt this towards the light so I can make sure that I can see all the way through the piece. If you can't, this piece will not function correctly. So I'm kind of pressing that in, adding little bits of clay very carefully so I don't block the hole or block the tube by applying too much pressure. And I always tend to check and make sure before I put it back together that I can see through it, all the way through it. If I can see through it, then I know that this is going to work. So once the tube is in place, you can start to score and slip your piece back together. So I'm scoring that ledge, that 1/4 of an inch ledge that I left around the whole piece. At this point, my clay is not super soft. It's stiffened up just enough that I know I can put this back together. If your clay is incredibly soft, you might have to let both sides stiffen up a little before you put it back together, because now that it's hollow, it could collapse. So you don't want to apply too much pressure. You want this just to be a little bit stiff. So really deep score marks, good amount of slip. Keep those score marks close together. And I'm going to carefully press these two together. You may have minor like shifts that you have to kind of come back and adjust and push things together. That happens. That's pretty normal, but you should be able to get it back to where it was. And then we have this seam to contend with. So this is a two-step process. And you've got to run your finger horizontally back and forth to initially blend that seam closed. Sometimes your modeling knife works. But you then have to go back and add clay over the entire seam. If you don't do that, your piece will split back open in the kiln. So this is step one for reattaching. You want to blend that seam back and forth. Try to get it to disappear as best you can without squashing or collapsing the piece because it is hollow now. And then what I'm going to do is kind of roll out these really thin and like kind of flattened coils, and I'm going to lay those directly over the seam all the way around the entire piece. I'm going to blend that back and forth. This is crucial. If you skip this, your piece will split in half. So I want this to be thin and small. I don't need a lot of clay. And then my pressure goes out horizontally. I'm not pushing down. If you push down, there's a really high probability of you actually collapsing your piece or creating an indentation or a divot that you can't fix unless you take the whole thing apart again. So I'm just going to carefully, slowly work my way around the form, kind of use the tools to refine and smooth again. So I'm going to work around the other side of the head, and then I will continue down the bottom of the form, being careful that I don't block the hole that I put into the piece. And the smaller the coil you work with, the easier it is to blend. So take the time to make it nice and small and delicate. That's all you need. I'm really being careful so I don't block that hole that is on the bottom of my piece. And now I have a successfully hollowed sculpture that has the tubing mechanism in place for this to become a hidden teapot or Korean water dropper.